The Legend of Zelda was a shocking experience for many gamers when it was first released back in the 80s, especially for North American console gamers. Its focus on exploration and progression was a big deal in an era when so many were still used to single-screen games that essentially boiled down to just being tests of the player's reflexes. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link may have been a similarly shocking experience, albeit for different reasons. It's known for being the black sheep of the long-running franchise, and many fans tend to either love it or hate it. I wasn't born yet back when it was new, so I can't tell you anything about what sort of vibes surrounded it at the time. Whether it was accepted despite its divergence from the original, on the grounds that fans hadn't yet formed big expectations about what a Zelda game should be, since the series was still very young and there wasn't an established formula yet, or whether fans felt betrayed by all of the changes and reacted with hostility. I wouldn't be surprised if the former is more accurate than the latter, though, since after all, many NES sequels, notably Castlevania 2 and the international version of Super Mario Bros. 2, experimented quite a lot, instead of just being content to add bells and whistles to a game that had already been made once before. Anyway, what I can tell you is that compared to other entries in the franchise, Zelda 2 is a horse of a different color, but it also has a larger legacy than it's often given credit for. Of the big changes from the first, some of them actually did stick around as permanent additions to the formula, while others would resurface again at some point later down the line. And over the course of my life, I have seen this game's reputation change a little bit. In the early days of the internet, people were much more likely to hate on it or dismiss it as a failed experiment than they are today. I guess more people have come around to giving it a fair shake and judging it on its own merits rather than simply play for 5 minutes and turn it off, because it doesn't fit quite as neatly into the stack of Zelda games we've gotten since. So what was the plot of the first game again? After all, I already made a video about it.
The story goes that once upon a time in the Kingdom of Hyrule, there was a legend of 3 golden triangles called the Triforce, each possessing magical properties and representing power, wisdom, and courage. One day, an army, led by the evil Ganon, invaded Hyrule and stole the Triforce of Power, which of course grants great strength. In order to prevent Ganon from also stealing the Triforce of Wisdom, Princess Zelda of Hyrule split it up into 8 fragments and scattered them throughout the land. She then recruited a boy called Link, the only one with enough courage to go after Ganon, to defeat him and take back the Triforce of Power. When Ganon got wind of this, he was pissed, and imprisoned Zelda in his dungeon. So now it's up to Link to recover the 8 fragments of the Triforce of Wisdom, and then scale Death Mountain to take Ganon out, reclaim the Triforce of Power, and rescue the damsel in distress. So where does the other part of the Triforce come in, the Triforce of Courage? They're saving that one for the sequel.
Yes, that's right. And now that we've made it to the sequel, how about that Triforce of Courage? Well, we learn here that it has been sealed up in what is referred to as the Great Palace, and that this game's version of Princess Zelda, who is not the same one that Link rescued from Ganon in the first game, was put under a sleeping spell during a dispute over the coveted item. It's up to Link, who is the same Link from the previous game, to find 6 palaces, this game's equivalent to the dungeons from the first, that are scattered across Hyrule, and insert a magic crystal in a statue found in each one, all of which of course guarded by a boss. In doing so, he will reveal the hidden Great Palace, and ultimately unite all 3 pieces of the Triforce and awaken the damsel from her slumber. This game is where the series first introduced the concept of multiple generations of Princess Zelda, making it clear that this game's Zelda is a different one from the first by establishing her to have been asleep for millenniums. Sounds pretty great if you ask me. This aspect of the lore would be retained as the franchise moved forward and expanded upon by also introducing new versions of Link. Meanwhile, while Ganon remains dead following the events of the first game, remnants of his army are still around, and they're after blood. Literally, Link's blood, as killing Link and sprinkling his blood over the ashes of Ganon will bring him back to life, as established by Zelda 2's Game Over screen. So the broad gameplay goals are pretty much the same as they were in the first. Just swap out dungeons for palaces, and swap out collecting Triforce shards for placing crystals in statues. The organization of everything within a vast overworld map is also similar, but nearly everything else is different. Tweaked at the very least, if not fundamentally changed. For starters, Zelda 2 is a bona fide action RPG. While the first game was often referred to as an RPG in North America back in 1987, especially in the context of console games, the only real RPG elements it had were a big open world map, NPCs to talk to, and currency to collect and buy items with. Zelda 2 takes things much further by adding experience points and a level up system, which distinguishes it from the previous game, as well as the many that came after, and makes the game a true RPG even by the modern definition. Killing enemies gains XP, and earning a certain amount will allow you to level up either your life bar, attack power, or magic meter. More on the magic meter later. And if you don't want to level up whatever skill you've just gained enough points for, you can keep your points and level up a different skill later on. Unfortunately, the infernal beeping that echoes through the speakers constantly anytime you're low on health returns in this game. I can't believe I forgot to mention that, and how annoying it is, in my review of the first game. It's not quite as persistent in Zelda 2, but it is just as grating. Anyway, you've probably noticed one of the other big things that causes Zelda 2 to be considered the black sheep. It's a side-scroller, or at least it mostly is. The more familiar top-down perspective is only used for getting from place to place on the overworld. The perspective changes anytime you enter a combat zone, which happens Final Fantasy or Pokemon style, although the combat is done in real time as opposed to turn-based. These combat zones can be avoided by staying on the overworld's main path, and differ depending on the terrain. You'll want to avoid enemies if possible in the swamps, since the water will slow you down and screw you all up, and especially want to avoid enemy encounters in the graveyards, because they will tear your ass to shreds. Gotta love that cheery tune as Link is walking by the King's Headstone. The music in Zelda 2 is really good for the most part, though. Anyway, sometimes fairies, returning from the first game, also show up in the overworld encounters. They can also be found in hidden locations, kinda like in the first game, but those locations are much harder to find here than they were back then. The shooty sword also returns if you're at full health, but it's tougher than ever to keep this time around, and when I get fully healed or start with a new life, I nearly always forget that I have it. The other times the perspective changes to side-scroller are anytime you enter a palace, anytime you enter a cave, or anytime you enter a town. We'll talk more about the towns later. It's also a pretty big deal that Link can jump now, something that wouldn't stick around for the immediate future but would be revived later on. And he's thankfully much closer to Mario than Simon Belmont when it comes to how nimble he is, because there are many segments in this game that require some light platforming. This is also the only Zelda game to have a lives system. You always start with 3, and losing 1 restarts you on the same area you died on, while losing all 3 will, for the vast majority of the game anyway, put you back at the starting point with the Sleepy Princess Zelda. This is arguably bad design, but it was extremely common for the time period. It's what I like to call artificial difficulty, since it doesn't really add to the challenge so much as it simply gives the player a chore by requiring them to race back to wherever they last died to continue pursuing the current objective. The other punishment for losing all lives is losing all unspent experience points, which means that this game is much less forgiving than the first. Because in the first, you'd never lose your rupees, which were the first game's currency used for buying items, absent from the sequel but returning in most if not all future installments, and the closest equivalent to Zelda 2's experience points. Zelda 2 is overall still pretty forgiving though, as you will never lose any levels you've cashed in, never lose any items you've found, and never have to redo placing a crystal in a palace after you've defeated a boss. Now let's talk about those towns. The original Legend of Zelda included NPCs to talk to and receive gameplay hints from, but Zelda 2 is the first in the franchise to introduce towns full of them, along with other NPCs who refill your life or magic meters, offer you side quests, and at times even had their own little stories and lore. This is probably the single biggest innovation that Zelda 2 made for the franchise, as all this would become a series staple. Anyway, the gameplay hints given by the NPCs in the first game were often vague and/or poorly translated, and had a tendency to leave a player with more questions than answers. So now that the amount of NPCs has increased exponentially in the sequel, Link receives not only vague and mysterious directions on where to go and what to do, but also a heaping helping of inane nonsense. If you speak to these NPCs, be prepared for many to have nothing to say at all beyond, "Sorry, I know nothing. I am much too busy to talk to a stranger," or even just simply, "Hello." The inhabitants of the water town of Soraya, which is pretty damn early on in the adventure by the way, even turn into bats and deal damage, One house only contains what appears to be a purple ball sack taking a nap. My personal favorite NPC is Error. Yeah, you meet him early on and he says, "I am Error." This is one of the more famous and memeable things in the game. Initially, all he does is introduce himself, but if you meet another guy later on who encourages you to talk to Error, Error will then give you a hint about finding one of the palaces. It's also worth mentioning that there's another character in the game called Bagu, which is the Japanese word for bug. Yeah, the translators overlooked translating Bagu's name, so the joke of having two NPCs called Bug and Error went over the heads of English-speaking audiences. Speaking of both Bagu and the other NPCs' hints regarding how to progress, you need to find Bagu, who is hidden in a forest location off the main path, in order to get a note to make a different NPC allow you to cross the river in the water town of Soraya to access a new area of the map. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in-game that hints as to how to find this remote location. This is only one example of something in the game that is vital to your progression that I likely would have never figured out without a guide. Each town also includes a wise old sage who will teach Link a spell upon retrieving an item or doing some other favor for a townsperson, or just fulfilling some other criteria. Some of the items are simply hidden in caves or other locations, and can be turned in easily by simply talking to everyone in each town until you find the right person. But others are just plain silly. How on earth would you ever figure out to go into an empty house and press the B button at the table within the house to find this hidden mirror? Then this bitch says, "I am thirsty." Okay? And? What do you mean you're thirsty? You want to bring Link home with you? Oh, what you're supposed to do is go to this fountain, which is in her line of sight, and get water for her. Link is such a gentleman. I'd have told her to get it herself, and without a guide, I'd have 100% assumed that this was just a nonsense phrase like so many others rather than a prompt. In one case, the item you have to get isn't an item at all. It's a whole-ass kid. As in, a human child, or a baby. How did Link pack this little dude around while trekking caves and fighting hordes of monsters before he delivered him to the correct townsperson? Also, they just lost a child in a cave? Should they really be getting him back at all? In truth, the NPC dialogue tells us he was kidnapped, but I'm doing entertainment over here. Even one of the towns itself is hidden, dropped in the middle of nowhere and needing uncovered. This is a cool bit of lore, though, as the townspeople will tell you they had to flee Kasuto, which if you found it first, and you probably did, you'll have found it deserted of most of its inhabitants and overrun by flying bloody tampons, which you can only see once you've found the cross. Until then, they're invisible and will light your ass up. No wonder all the people bounced. Two of the towns also include a swordsman, who will teach Link how to stab downward and then upward, while in mid-jump. We'll go more in depth later about what the spells do, and about the swordplay. And about the special items. Patience is a virtue. Anyway, the first Zelda filled me up with a sense of adventure, and made me want to explore and discover hidden secrets. I only used a guide in that game when I was truly stuck. In the case of Zelda 2, however, I started off by trying to figure out things for myself, but it didn't take long until I got frustrated and wanted to just have a checklist of what to do and how to do it every time I entered a new town, so I could just get through with it. The secrets in Zelda 2 just seemed too cryptic to figure out, and I wasn't having fun trying. I quickly started to enjoy the game a lot more once I resorted to a guide, and really valued the sense of direction that it provided. I don't know whether or not Zelda 2 is actually that much harder than the first in terms of its exploration and secrets, or if the game's focus on combat, and my own trials and tribulations in mastering said combat, simply distracted me from it and prevented me from tightening up my thinking cap. Yes, combat is huge in Zelda 2, and I'm surprised I've gone this long without touching on it. It's arguably the single biggest part of the game, yet another attribute which sets it apart from every other entry in the series, in which combat is much less of a focal point. Despite the amount of exploration Zelda 2 has, there really aren't any puzzles at all. It's all about that swordplay, and the combat system is deep, unlike anything else I've personally played on the NES. The mechanics of attacking high, attacking low, blocking high, and blocking low takes some getting used to, especially if you go in expecting it to be like the first game. Which it isn't, at all. In the beginning, I had to really push myself to get used to it, and I wasn't always enjoying it. But I'm glad I toughed it out because it was so rewarding to get the hang of. Fairly early on, you'll meet a swordsman, or at least hopefully early on if you're able to find him, and he'll teach you the down thrust maneuver, which is vital to master to make combat more efficient, and even required for some of the bosses. It's super useful for getting over the top of some of the tougher enemies if you just want to avoid them, as well as for taking out the really small and weak ones. Using it was tricky for me at first, but once I got comfortable, oh, so satisfying. Much later, you'll also learn the up thrust, and while it isn't required for anything, it's a godsend for getting through the Valley of Death, which we'll talk about later. This combat system is so freaking cool that it's probably enough on its own to make me prefer Zelda 2 over the original. And it's difficult to overstate how deep, groundbreaking, and advanced it was for a system with a controller that only had a D-pad and 2 face buttons. It would prove to be very influential, and its legacy can even be felt within Link's moveset in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. You need to achieve a certain level of mastery of the combat system even for tackling the very first palace in the game. I didn't, and I got my ass handed to me. Grinding out a few levels doesn't hurt either, especially attack levels, considering how many hits some of these bastards take when you're weak, a gaming pet peeve of mine. In fact, I'd recommend you do some grinding as soon as you start playing, and find each of the hidden XP bags that are close to the game's starting point to make it easier, and be mindful of your XP for the rest of the game. Remember, you lose it all if you game over, so if you're close to leveling up, grind conservatively. Go to and from a town to refill your health and magic while picking on easy enemies in the combat zones. You also automatically level up when you defeat a boss and place a crystal, so if you're close to leveling up right before a boss, grind it out before the fight so you can get 2 levels. I very much enjoyed the grind in Zelda 2. No one likes a game that requires too much of it, but for me, a game that requires just enough grinding can be quite soothing in its repetition. But yes, about tightening your combat skills to a certain level before even the first palace is doable. I went in unprepared and the Iron Knuckles made it unbearable for me. Until I got good, brah. Don't play scared when dealing with these assholes. Go straight for their throat and force them to toe right up to you too. Jumping and then stabbing as you come back down is the best strategy. That said, it's not always practical. Enemy placement gets tougher as you reach the later palaces, and sometimes the Iron Knuckles are placed in close quarters that are not conducive to the jumping strategy, unless you're able to lure them out, which is also not always practical. Other times it's tough to fight them because you're just overwhelmed by a barrage of other enemies as well as lava underneath you. But yeah, once you get the skills, it's easy to appreciate a duel with an Iron Knuckle from a development perspective. They react to your every move, and showcase some really impressive AI for the time. Another enemy I enjoyed fighting was the Hammer Bro. Yes, I know it's not a real Hammer Bro, but the arc of its attacks reminds me of a Hammer Bro, so that's what I'm gonna call it. I can't really explain why it was so fun, especially when I despise the real Hammer Bros as much as I do. It just was. These dragon head things are kinda cool too. They make you get into a rhythm. So do the crumbly bridges. If you listen closely, you can hear the game designer laughing his ass off at the placement of this XP bag. But I hate these bouncing skulls, and these bipedal fox things. Just annoying. Especially annoying that they can sap your magic or experience points if they touch you, but they don't give you experience points for killing them. The falling blocks piss the shit out of me as well. Much is often made about this game's level of difficulty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the difficulty is mostly pretty fair. It does, however, have its share of typical NES fuck shit. Seemingly unavoidable projectiles, pits that drop you directly on top of enemies. You'll learn quickly to always have the down thrust button held when you're falling. The knockback physics and the lava pits also make even the weakest enemies in the game a true threat. In the original Legend of Zelda, I didn't need a walkthrough for any of the dungeons other than the final one. I often needed a walkthrough to find the dungeons, but that's another story. Simply getting from the beginning of the dungeon to the end was always very doable until the skull-shaped labyrinth of terror containing Ganon. In Zelda 2, I also enjoyed exploring the palaces blind. Really, I did, especially in comparison to exploring the overworld. Exploring the palaces is probably the most Zelda-like thing in a game that's often accused of being un-Zelda-like, so I'd recommend doing it. It was rewarding to look for keys to open doors, with locked doors and hidden keys returning from the first game, and to find items or bosses on my own, with the mystery and surprise being part of the fun. There's no in-game map or compass to discover them like there is in the first though, so it's a lot harder. I only consulted online maps of palaces after exhausting everything, but I still had to do a lot of that compared to the first game. Yes, the cryptic nature of Zelda 2 rears its head quite a bit within the palaces as well. Like, there's one where you have to walk through the wall. How on earth did anyone ever guess that back in the day? Other times it's necessary to take a leap of faith. I'll concede that I probably should have known better than to try a leap of faith here, but I didn't have enough magic points to fly over the gap with fairy magic. We'll get to that stuff later. So it seemed worth a try. Then there's this absolute bullshit, which is technically on the overworld, but it's in the area immediately surrounding a palace, where you have to navigate a maze with enemy encounters and twists and turns sprinkled throughout. I looked up the solution to it almost immediately. Seriously, fuck figuring this out. Yeah, as stated before, each of the first 6 palaces that Link must place a crystal in contain one boss guarding the statue where the crystal goes. Most of these bosses are pretty damn easy, both in figuring out what their weakness is and in actually executing the strategy once you figure it out. The only one I didn't care for was this dragon boss. It's both tedious and unfun. Even with my attack level almost maxed out, it took way too many hits to kill. And as I've already noted, that's a piss off of mine. Long, boring, and the slightest error can sink you. Literally. Knockback is very frustrating when fighting this boss. The other big thing in each of the first 6 palaces is an item. I mentioned before that there are no rupees in this game, but that's almost immaterial because there are so many items to find, even if you're not buying them from shops this time around. The first palace contains the candle. Check out the creative way I got past the iron knuckle, since they were still giving me a lot of trouble at the time. Anyway, the candle is kinda like a key in a way, because it enables you to see in the dark caves, and you're not gonna get through very many of them without it. Funnily enough though, you do have to go through one dark cave in order to get it from the palace in the first place. Get ready to memorize the exact spot of the one enemy that's inside it. But yeah, once I got the candle, that's when I realized that items are used much differently in Zelda 2 than in the original. Instead of selecting from an inventory screen, it just automatically gets used whenever it's needed. Meaning that the items in this game tend to be very situational. The second item is one of only 2 that's not found in a palace. Instead, it's found at the end of Death Mountain, a recurring location in the franchise, placed near the beginning of this installment in particular, after being placed near the end of the original game. Death Mountain lives up to its name. When people whine about Zelda 2 being too difficult, I imagine that this location has a lot to do with that, especially considering its placement near the beginning of the adventure. This area is as hard as a 10-ton bag of bricks. First of all, it's a maze, and much like the Palace Maze, I had no interest in figuring this convoluted bullshit out. It's all guesswork and memorization. Online walkthrough, here I come. Secondly, it's packed with enemies, most notably these psycho axe-wielding, and sometimes axe-chucking, certified bad motherfuckers. Multiple parts of Death Mountain, this one for example, would be far easier if you had the down thrust. But alas, it's not available at this point in the game. Neither are most of the spells. We'll talk about spells later, but the shield spell and life spell are the only 2 you might have at this point in the game that'll be of any use to you in Death Mountain. Anyway, the prize at the end is the hammer, which breaks boulders on the overworld, and having it means you can open up paths that allow you to skip Death Mountain from now on, and believe me, you'll want to. So the hammer is basically a key. The next palace has a glove, which allows you to break heavy blocks within palaces that you couldn't previously break. So it's basically a key. Next is the raft, making a return from the first game, which allows you to sail across the water onto a new area of the map. So it's basically a key. The next item? The boots, which allow Link to walk on water just like our Lord and Savior Christ himself. So it's basically a key. It was when I was collecting the boots that I realized how vulnerable Link is when getting these items. I was paralyzed in the item grabbing animation, which allowed the Iron Knuckle to kill me. Granted, I was going to die anyway, so I decided to just make a break for the item and see if I could get it without killing the pesky Iron Knuckle. Then there's the flute. It allows Link to dispose of the River Devil blocking the path to a new area of the map. Meaning that it is a key! Are we noticing a pattern here? Now, I somewhat get it. The main purpose of the need for these items is to impede progress and encourage exploration, but it would be nice if they weren't, like, the most situational items in the history of gaming. The second of the two items that you won't find in a palace is found in one of the last towns you're likely to find in the game. Literally a key. Yes, it's a magic key, and can be used in the palaces to open locked doors over and over again, so you no longer need to find any of the hidden keys within the palaces once you get this one. I think it's actually required for the 7th and final palace that only becomes available upon completing the first 6. Of course, I don't think the game tells you that anywhere, so if you make it to that palace without the magic key, I guess you're just screwed. I imagine it would be incredibly frustrating to be searching and searching for more keys in that final palace when there literally aren't any more to be found. The final item is the cross, which I already mentioned earlier. It allows you to see the previously invisible flying bloody tampons. You could also lump the hearts and magic containers in with the items too, I guess, which expand the capacity for your health meter and magic meter, respectively. So yeah, you can probably tell that I wish that the items were handled differently. That they actually had a wider variety of uses and weren't basically keys for the most part. Well, the spells are handled better. Not perfect, but better. As I've previously mentioned, you learn these from the wise old sages in the towns after completing a side quest of sorts. Anytime you use a spell, your magic meter, something introduced to the franchise here that would become a mainstay, will go down. In order to fill it back up, you'll need to find these red refill jugs. They're hidden in some locations on the map and occasionally dropped by enemies. You can also sometimes get them out of the gargoyles in the palaces and the Iron Knuckle statues outside of the palaces, which sometimes turn into an Iron Knuckle instead, so stabbing at them is a gamble. Each time you use a spell, it's good for one screen only, so you must use them wisely in order to get far in the game, because that magic meter can really deplete quickly depending on the spells that you're using and the frequency with which you use them. The first spell you'll likely find is the shield spell, which is exactly what it sounds like. A spell that makes enemies deal less damage when you take a hit. I used it a ton. Then there's the jump magic, which makes you jump really high. It's basically a key, since you need it to jump to certain locations. To be fair though, you can find creative uses for it. Some bosses might be easier with it depending on your playstyle, others might seem like they would be easier but actually end up being harder. The jump spell is also required to reach each of the swordsmen, the second of which requires Link to jump across rooftops and then down the chimney like Mario down a pipe. Nintendo really blew an opportunity to put the Mario sound effect in. Jumping onto a roof and then going down the chimney is another example of something that I would have never thought to do without a guide. But you're probably getting the idea by now that certain spells are needed to acquire certain items, or in this case sword techniques. Certain items are needed to open certain paths, certain sword techniques are needed to complete certain palaces, and so on and so forth. Everything is layered, like an onion.
Onions have layers.
Then there's the life spell, which is what it sounds like, swapping magic points for health. This will likely be the spell you use the most. It certainly was for me. Then there's arguably the most overpowered spell of the bunch, the fairy magic, which to be fair does cost a lot of magic points to cast. You need it to pass some areas, so it's kinda like, you guessed it, a key. But there are many uses for it, notably skipping a room full of difficult enemies. You can't do everything as a fairy that you can as Link though, so sometimes that strategy isn't practical. The fire spell gives Link a projectile weapon, and for some enemies it's the only way to damage them. Despite that, I don't think this spell is technically required for completion, unless there's something I'm forgetting, and I personally barely used it. Reflect, on the other hand, is an attack spell that is needed, because it's the only way to damage one of the bosses. It's pretty cool, acting as a counter for certain enemies' attacks. The penultimate spell is called Spell. They really got creative with that one. Its primary function is to allow you to get the magic key item. A key to get a key. At least there actually is a decent hint from an NPC to figure this one out. The spell can also turn enemies into weaker enemies, but I personally never used it at all, aside from to get the magic key. Finally, there's the Thunder spell, which we'll talk about later. Now, we're going to talk about the Valley of Death. The Valley of Death is the stretch of land that leads to the Great Palace, which becomes the main objective once you've placed crystals in all 6 of the initial palaces. After all, the Great Palace is where the Triforce of Courage is. Anyway, some people insist that Death Mountain, near the beginning of the game, is actually the hardest part of Zelda 2. Well, those people are fucking crazy! I'll grant you that Death Mountain is the biggest difficulty spike prior to the Valley of Death. But the Valley of Death is like a culmination of all the frustrating bullshit scattered throughout other parts of the game, all melded together into a piss-off cocktail and dialed up to 100 proof. If you haven't mastered blocking high and low, attacking high and low, down thrusting, and up thrusting before the Valley of Death, you will definitely have to master it on the way in order to make it to the end. Ask me how I know. I had actually forgotten that up thrusting was even a thing before I began this trek, but it was a technique that was invaluable for disposing of these erratic flying enemies. There are pits of lava everywhere here, and the knockback physics reach a crescendo of hard-as-nails cruelty. You won't brute force your way through the Valley of Death with sloppy swordplay. You have to earn every inch of progress, and even if you're really good, you still might get screwed over by a cheap hit from time to time, or even a series of them. Once you make it to the Great Palace, this screen will become your new respawn point, instead of the previous one in front of Sleepy Zelda. Just be careful to never choose save when you game over. Otherwise, you will be sent all the way back and have to do the Valley of Death all over again. Ask me how I know. Always select continue. Again, I personally feel that the difficulty of Zelda 2 is often exaggerated, but trying to get through the Great Palace without a map or a walkthrough would just be a whole new level of comedic suffering. It's ginormous, with so many complex twists and turns and cryptic bullshit. You are thrown a bone with a fairy room being placed on the most efficient path to the bosses. Yes, that's bosses, plural. And yes, fairy rooms are a thing in the palaces this time around, offering a nice respite from difficulty that's often considered high. But good luck finding the most efficient path without a map or a guide. If you did this back in the day, you have my utmost respect, but there is no way I'd have the patience, especially when, as stated before, you could potentially enter the palace without the magic key and without knowing that you need it, or even knowing it exists. If you do look up a guide, the Great Palace isn't that hard. You just have to memorize it. The hardest part is this one completely absurd enemy. I could never find an efficient way to fight him, so I settled into the strategy of just blowing past him, which had a pretty mixed rate of success. The most annoying parts were the false platforms. I just used the fairy magic to get past them. The Great Palace is also where I discovered that the incredibly rare 1-Up doll does not respawn after you've collected it once. That is sadistic. So you won't want to collect it until you've already learned the final bosses well enough for having an extra life to actually matter. The first of 2 bosses is the Thunderbird, and this is where the final spell, Thunder, is required to reveal the boss's weak spot. In other words, the spell is a key, you may not have the spell or even know that you need it, and its only real function is to drain a gigantic portion of your magic meter as soon as the battle begins, or to make the battle completely impossible if you arrive to the boss with your magic meter already depleted. Anyway, if you know what you're doing, the Thunderbird isn't that hard after having a few tries to get used to it, but still, it is no doubt the toughest boss you've faced in the game so far. Until the next boss. The big one. The final boss. The boss after this boss. Dark Link. Arguably the biggest example of Zelda 2's lasting legacy, as Dark Link would become a franchise mainstay and Nintendo icon. And I did the infamous crouch in the corner cheese. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I saw the end of the game for the purpose of this video, and I was almost dead and on my last life, and I was absolutely sick of speedrunning the same route in the Great Palace again and again and again. I'm not sure why this was so important to me, as the ending is just typical NES stuff. You unite the Triforce, wake up Princess Zelda, blah blah blah. Then the curtain falls on Link and Zelda. Looks like that one NPC wasn't the only thirsty one in this game. Get it, Link? Unfortunately, the game autosaves after you beat it, so if you go for the cheese, you can't just go right back and try to do it legit, as your file will have moved on to the second quest, which is much like the second quest in the first game. I guess that's what I get for taking the easy way out. So then, I downloaded a ROM of the game along with a save file with all the important stuff collected and unlocked, fired it up in the old emulator, raced to the end of the palace, and created a save state right before Dark Link. And, well, he's actually not that hard. Hear me out. Yes, he's quick as greased lightning, and yes, he has no pattern, instead being equipped with AI that reacts to your every move. But when I had an infinite amount of cracks at him in a row, each time with a full life bar and full magic meter, thanks to save states, it only took me a few tries to learn the strategy necessary to put him down. What worked for me was when engaged with Dark Link, you want to constantly be throwing out stabs and blocking low, alternating to ensure he lands as few hits as possible, and also backing up and baiting him as often as you can, to get in some forward thrusts while coming down from a jump, not to be confused with a down thrust, as often as you can, similar to the strategy with the Iron Knuckle. Further, you need to know that anytime Dark Link is in the air, he's vulnerable. If you see him jump, get ready to stab, because he can't block when he's in the air. Also, you'll want to cast Shield immediately. If you have your magic meter leveled up all the way, and enter the battle with it full, you'll have enough points to cast Shield at the beginning, and still have enough left for one life spell if you need it. The real difficulty with the Dark Link battle isn't the Dark Link battle itself. It's the fact that if you're not using save states, the Dark Link battle is merely the final phase in a lengthy and absolutely punishing gauntlet. Remember, you only get 3 lives, and when you lose them all, it's back to the beginning of the Great Palace. Meaning that if you're playing without a save state, you have to A. Make it all the way through the very long, very difficult, and very confusing maze that is the Great Palace, which is designed to drain both your life bar and your magic meter, and in which one wrong turn will sink you, hopefully all on your first life, which you'll likely lose immediately upon reaching the Thunderbird if you hadn't lost it already. And then, B, hopefully on your second life and with a full life bar and magic meter, defeat the Thunderbird, which requires you to cast the most magic meter draining spell to even make the fight possible, that you likely won't have enough points to cast on your first life. And C, defeat Dark Link, hopefully on your third and final life, with a full life bar and magic meter, since the Thunderbird will have drained a massive chunk of your magic on your second life, and probably a lot of your life bar too. Screw up any of those variables and it's going to be very difficult, and in some cases impossible, to string everything together, and you'll need to do that if you're playing legit and without save states. So yeah, that's what makes Dark Link seem so damn tough, because even getting in any good tries with him to learn the strategy is an extremely difficult task on its own. Using an emulator and save states is an excellent way to practice and get good at the individual parts of the gauntlet that are giving you trouble, so that you can eventually take the training wheels off, so to speak, and string it all together on only 3 lives. I look forward to doing just that on my next playthrough of Zelda 2, since I now know for a fact that I am capable of beating Dark Link. It's just a matter of stringing together a good enough run to get all of the gauntlet conquered on only 3 lives. Another thing I learned using this save state method is that Dark Link is actually a very fun boss fight. Something that may not be obvious if you're making it to him with a depleted life bar and magic meter, dying within 10 seconds, and then being demoralized by having to run through the Great Palace yet again. When I was just a couple hours into Zelda 2, I thought my eventual review would be a mostly negative one. I almost couldn't have been more wrong. The early encounters with the Iron Knuckles were the biggest thing that made me want to quit. But I am so glad I persevered, because getting Link leveled up to the point that he could annihilate those sons of bitches in only 2, and later 1 hit, was so satisfying. If you've played a bunch of other games in the franchise and loved them, this one might trigger a strong negative reaction right away. On the contrary, if you played other Zelda games and didn't care for them, especially if you wished they were more combat heavy, or closer to a true RPG experience, Zelda 2 might be just what the doctor ordered for you. But yeah, if you find yourself saying, "What the hell is this?" after giving it a go, I think that's totally understandable, but I'd nonetheless encourage you to stick with it and push yourself at least a little bit further after you initially want to quit. Or if you've already abandoned it, to give it one more chance, because there's so much to love about this interesting, unique, trailblazing, excellent game. A pick up and play? This is not. Not even close. The control scheme is something that must be learned, but it's so worth learning, because there's nothing else on the console like it, even if it may feel janky at first. It certainly did for me, but persistence is key. And by the way, the first game is not pick up and play either, and the devs were self-aware of that fact, even going as far as to beg players to read the manual in an in-game cutscene. It's been a minute since I've played the original Legend of Zelda, but going off of memory, I definitely like Zelda 2 more. If you're used to later games in the franchise, going back to the first can be tough, because as revolutionary as it was and as good as it still is, it's undeniably an unpolished version of the Zelda formula that we all know and love. But Zelda 2 is a totally different beast, yet still managed to feel familiar to me in a lot of ways. That's because despite being known as the Black Sheep, its legacy is still strong. The addition of towns, the expanded roles of NPCs, the magic meter, the swordplay mechanics that would find their way into the Super Smash Bros. Franchise, Dark Link, the idea of there being multiple versions of Princess Zelda across different generations, all of that stuff has its roots in Zelda 2. Even the enemy encounters on the overworld, which would of course evolve significantly, still owe a lot to the way that they were implemented in this game right here. Yes, the difficulty is uneven, but that's the case with a lot of NES games. And no, it's not so hard that it's impossible. Yes, the item system could have been implemented better, and yes, the game is cryptic as all hell. I'd actually say it's even worse than the first in that regard. But it's the 21st century now.
We have technology!
This game has its flaws. It's rough around the edges, and like most NES games, has its share of cheap bullshit. But the good parts, which are often groundbreaking and unlike anything else on the console, vastly outweigh the bad. And with that, I think I'm finally finished talking about Zelda 2. If you enjoyed my verbal diarrhea, I'd appreciate you smashing the like button, leaving a comment, subscribing, and ringing the bell to get a notification for when I talk about another nearly 40-year-old game. Maybe another that still saves, like this one did. Gotta love a save file named Dad. Okay, I'm definitely done talking about Zelda 2 now. Thank you for sticking with me for so long. This has been a Leaky Faucet review. I'm outie.